Welcome to this deep exploration of Carl Jung's psychology. In this audiobook, we will journey into one of Jung's most fascinating insights, the idea that human thinking is not singular, but divided into two very different modes. This chapter, called Two Kinds of Thinking, first appeared in Jung's seminal book Symbols of Transformation. It marks a turning point in psychology, where the human mind is seen not as a machine of pure logic, but as a living system that balances reason and imagination. Jung believed that understanding these two forms of thought is essential, not only for psychology but for anyone seeking to understand themselves. Introduction: Why thinking matters. Let us begin by asking, what is thinking? To most of us, thinking feels like an invisible stream running through our minds, sometimes clear, sometimes chaotic. But Jung wanted to analyze this stream to break it down into distinct currents. He observed that people do not all think in the same way. There is one mode that is structured, logical, and problem-solving, and another mode that is fluid, image-based, and closer to dreams than to mathematics. These are what he called directed thinking and fantasy thinking. Directed thinking is the kind of thought you are using right now, as you listen and make sense of these words. Fantasy thinking, on the other hand, is the mode you enter when your mind drifts, when images and associations appear unbidden, like a daydream or a story unfolding on its own. Jung insisted that both are vital. Our civilization depends on directed thinking, science, law, philosophy, but our soul depends on fantasy thinking. Myths, art, religion, imagination. Neglect one, and the human being becomes unbalanced. Directed thinking, the logic of civilization. Let us first look at directed thinking. Jung describes it as verbal, logical, goal-oriented. It is the form of thought that follows a line, step by step, toward a conclusion. It is the language of science, mathematics, engineering, and philosophy. When you solve a problem, plan your day, or write a report, you are practicing directed thinking. It is conscious, intentional, and deliberate. The nature of directed thought. Directed thinking relies on words and abstract symbols. It takes sensory experience and reduces it into categories, definitions, and logical chains. For example, if you see a tree, fantasy thinking may imagine it as a sacred being or a symbol of life. Directed thinking, however, will analyze its height, classify its species, and measure its age in years. This reduction of reality into abstract terms is powerful. It allows us to predict, control, and manipulate the world. It is what made science possible. It is what allowed humanity to build cities, machines, and technologies. But it comes at a cost. It distances us from the raw experience of life. Historical development. Jung argued that directed thinking is not natural in the sense of being original. It had to be developed slowly throughout history. Primitive humans, he claimed, lived mostly in the mode of fantasy thinking, guided by images, myths, and dreams. It took thousands of years for humans to cultivate abstract reasoning, mathematics, and philosophy. Think of the invention of writing. It transformed thought from oral stories and images into structured symbols. With writing, directed thinking took a leap forward because now thoughts could be recorded, compared, and logically arranged. Examples in everyday life. Consider your own day. When you budget your expenses, write an email, or follow a recipe, you are practicing directed thought. It demands focus. It consumes energy. And, as Jung noted, it cannot be maintained indefinitely. That is why, after hours of logical work, the mind slips into daydreams, the other mode of thinking taking its turn. Advantages of directed thinking. The strengths of directed thinking are clear. It creates order out of chaos. It enables communication across time and space. It builds science and technology. But Jung warned that when directed thinking dominates, life becomes mechanical. We reduce everything to numbers and categories, losing touch with the symbolic and the sacred. Limits and fatigue. Jung made a striking observation. Directed thinking is tiring. It requires conscious effort and concentration. If you have ever studied for hours, you know the sensation. The brain becomes weary and the mind slips away. This slipping is not weakness. It is the psyche restoring balance by moving into the other kind of thinking. So, directed thought is not the natural resting state of the mind. It is an achievement, but one that must alternate with the freer, spontaneous stream of fantasy. A double-edged sword. Directed thinking is like a tool. Sharp, precise, and powerful. But a tool cannot tell you what is worth building. That guidance comes from another place, from imagination, from values, from symbols. Without fantasy thinking, directed thought risks becoming sterile, even destructive. Science without imagination is blind. And imagination without science is chaos. Here, at the end of Part 1, we have traced the outlines of directed thinking, its nature, its history, its strengths, and its limits. But Jung did not stop here. He turned his gaze toward the other stream, the deeper current of fantasy thinking, the form of thought that flows not in logic, but in images, myths, and dreams. This we will explore in the next chapter. In the last section, we explored directed thinking, logical, structured, conscious thought. It is the foundation of science and civilization. But Jung realized that this was only half of the story. Beneath the surface of logic lies another, more ancient stream of thought, fantasy thinking. Unlike directed thinking, fantasy thought does not move in straight lines. It is circular, fluid, and image-based. It is the language of myths, dreams, and spontaneous imagination. To Jung, fantasy thinking was not inferior or childish, it was essential. For it is here, in images and stories, that the unconscious speaks. The nature of fantasy thought. Fantasy thinking is not verbal but symbolic. It does not analyze or reduce, it creates. Where directed thought might define a lion as a species of animal, fantasy thought sees the lion as a symbol of courage, royalty, or danger. It is associative rather than linear. One image calls forth another, like a dream where a house turns into a forest, and the forest into a vast ocean. There is no fixed path. The mind wanders freely, guided by emotion and intuition. In everyday life, you may notice this mode when you drift off in thought, when a song evokes a memory, or when you imagine what could have been if life had taken another turn. Fantasy thought does not aim for solutions. Its goal is not to solve a problem, but to reveal inner meaning. Primitive roots. Jung argued that fantasy thinking is the original form of human thought. Long before humans developed mathematics or logic, they lived in a world of myths and symbols. The sun was not a ball of fire in the sky, it was a god, a giver of life, a cosmic eye. The river was not water flowing downhill, it was a spirit, a mother, a boundary between worlds. This mythic worldview was not wrong. It was the psyche's first way of understanding reality. Even today, in children, we see fantasy thinking dominate. Children personify toys, animals, and even objects. A doll becomes a friend, the moon a guardian, the thunder a voice of gods. Fantasy thinking is spontaneous, effortless, and deeply human. It is not an escape from reality. It is a way of experiencing reality through meaning. Myths and dreams. For Jung, the clearest examples of fantasy thinking appear in dreams and myths. A dream does not argue logically, it shows images. You may dream of flying, of falling, of meeting a stranger in a dark forest. Each dream is symbolic, carrying layers of meaning. Myths too are collective dreams. Across cultures we find recurring symbols. The hero, the mother, the wise old man, the trickster. These are not inventions of one mind, but expressions of the collective unconscious. Fantasy thinking is therefore not random. It follows deep patterns, archetypes that repeat across time and culture. The logic of symbols. Unlike directed thinking, fantasy thought has no interest in definitions. Instead, it works through symbols, images that point beyond themselves. A symbol is not a sign. A sign points to one fixed thing. The word tree means a physical tree. But a symbol opens into multiple meanings. The tree as life, as growth, as connection between heaven and earth. Symbols are living. They evolve, they shift, they carry emotional power. They cannot be reduced to one equation. That is why religions, myths, and art are so powerful. They speak to us in symbols that bypass rational analysis and touch the unconscious directly. Fantasy in art and literature. Think of poetry. When a poet writes about the moon, they are not describing its size or orbit. They are evoking loneliness, love, longing, mystery. Think of music. A melody does not define or argue. It moves the heart, stirring feelings that words cannot fully capture. Think of novels. Characters and plots often function as symbols for inner struggles, the hero's journey, the fall from grace, the search for redemption. All of these are forms of fantasy thinking. They enrich life by adding depth and meaning. Fantasy and the unconscious. Jung emphasized that fantasy thinking is the language of the unconscious. The unconscious does not speak in logical sentences. It speaks in dreams, images, symbols, and metaphors. This is why dream interpretation was so important to Jung. By paying attention to fantasy thought, we gain access to the hidden parts of ourselves. To ignore fantasy is to cut ourselves off from half of our psyche. Modern denial of fantasy. Our modern world, built on science and reason, tends to dismiss fantasy as childish or irrational. But Jung warned that repressing fantasy thought is dangerous. It does not disappear. It returns in symptoms, neuroses, and collective hysteria. The myths we reject reappear as obsessions. The symbols we deny come back as projections onto others. When society denies fantasy, people hunger for it. They find it in movies, novels, video games, modern myths that carry the same archetypes as ancient legends. Fantasy is creative power. Fantasy thinking is not only personal, it is creative. Every invention begins as a fantasy. Every scientific discovery starts with an imaginative leap. Einstein himself said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." He saw his theories not as pure logic, but as visions, thought experiments, fantasy disciplined into directed form. Thus, fantasy is not the opposite of reason. It is its partner. Reason shapes, but fantasy inspires. Daydreams and reverie. Jung also pointed out that in daily life we drift in and out of fantasy thought. Sitting by a window watching the clouds, your mind drifts. You imagine conversations, replay memories, or construct scenarios that never happened. This is not wasted time. It is the psyche replenishing itself, balancing the fatigue of directed thought. Often, insights arise in such moments. The solution to a problem may come not during focused effort, but when you step away and allow fantasy to wander. The child within. Jung linked fantasy thinking to the child archetype, the spontaneous, creative, uncorrupted part of the psyche. In fantasy, we reconnect with this inner child. We allow ourselves to play, to imagine, to explore without immediate purpose. This is not regression. It is nourishment. To deny the child within is to become rigid and lifeless. To embrace fantasy is to remain alive, curious, and open. At this point, we see the richness of fantasy thinking. Its roots in myth and dream, its language of symbols, its role in art, creativity, and the unconscious. But the story does not end here. Jung was clear. Neither directed nor fantasy thought is sufficient on its own. The true challenge is how these two kinds of thinking interact, how reason and imagination can balance and enrich one another. This we will explore in the next chapter. We have now explored the two great rivers of the human mind, directed thinking and fantasy thinking. One is logical, structured, and deliberate. The other is symbolic, image-based, and spontaneous. Carl Jung believed that these two streams are not enemies but partners. They exist in tension, but it is a tension that makes life whole. The dance of two modes. Think of the mind as a pendulum. It swings between directed thought, focused, rational, analytical, and fantasy thought, wandering, imaginative, symbolic. Neither can dominate forever. If you force yourself into constant logic, the mind rebels with dreams and daydreams. If you sink into endless fantasy, reality demands your attention through hunger, deadlines, and survival. The psyche knows this balance intuitively. It needs both modes to remain healthy. Dangers of one-sided thinking. Jung warned that when one kind of thinking dominates, imbalance and pathology arise. Overuse of directed thinking. When society worships only rationality, we reduce life to numbers and functions. We may achieve progress in science and technology, but people feel empty, disconnected, even soulless. Modern burnout, anxiety, and the feeling of meaninglessness often come from this overemphasis on directed thought. Overuse of fantasy thinking. On the other side, when fantasy thinking dominates without grounding, People may lose touch with reality. They may drift into illusions, conspiracy theories, or grandiose myths that collapse under real-world pressure. Fantasy without reason is chaos. Reason without fantasy is despair. A complementary relationship. The genius of Jung's insight is this. The two modes need each other. Directed thought shapes and refines the raw material of fantasy. Fantasy feeds directed thought with images, inspiration, and meaning. Think of a scientist. Their logical experiments are guided by a creative intuition, a fantasy of how things might work. Without that fantasy, there would be no hypothesis to test. Think of an artist. Their creative visions must be shaped into form, language, or craft, a directed effort, for others to experience them. Thus, directed and fantasy thought form a cycle of creation. One dreams, the other builds. Symbols as a bridge. Jung saw symbols as the bridge between these two modes. Fantasy produces symbols spontaneously. In dreams, art, myths. Directed thought interprets and integrates them into conscious life. This is why Jung developed methods like dream analysis and active imagination. They allow us to take the raw material of fantasy and bring it into dialogue with our conscious, rational self. Practical Jungian methods. So how can we apply this in daily life? How do we balance the two modes of thinking? Here are Jung-inspired practices to cultivate harmony. 1. Dream journaling. Each morning, write down your dreams before they fade. Do not analyze them too quickly. Simply record the images, the feelings, the symbols. Over time, patterns emerge, showing you what your unconscious is working through. 2. Active imagination. Set aside quiet time. Allow an image from a dream or fantasy to arise. Engage it. Ask it questions, let it speak back, draw or write what it shows. This brings fantasy into conscious dialogue, guided by directed thought. 3. Creative expression. Painting, writing, music, dance. All are ways to channel fantasy thinking. The goal is not to create a masterpiece, but to give form to what lies beneath the surface. 4. Mindful reflection. Balance creative fantasy with reflective logic. After you create, step back and analyze. What does this symbol mean for me? How can I live it out? 5. Balancing work and rest. Notice when directed thought becomes exhausting. Instead of pushing harder, allow moments of daydream, reverie, or play. These restore the psyche's natural rhythm. A modern example. Consider the world of innovation. Steve Jobs once said that creativity is simply connecting things. This is the marriage of fantasy and direction. The fantasy sees unexpected connections. The directed mind builds them into products. Artists, scientists, leaders, all thrive when both modes are honored. Individuation and wholeness. For Jung, balancing these two modes was not only practical, it was spiritual. He saw individuation, the journey toward becoming whole, as the integration of opposites. Reason and imagination are such opposites. To live fully, one must not repress either, but unite them. The goal is not to eliminate tension. It is to live within it, to let the two modes enrich one another. Closing thoughts for Part 3. So far we have seen directed thinking, the logic of civilization, fantasy thinking, the language of the unconscious, and their necessary balance which creates wholeness. In the next and final section, we will explore Jung's closing insights on these two kinds of thought, and how they shape not only the individual, but the collective destiny of humanity. We have traveled through Jung's profound insight into the two kinds of thinking. We have seen directed thought, the sharp blade of logic, science, and order, and fantasy thought, the flowing river of symbols, myths, and dreams. These two modes may appear opposed, but Jung showed us that they are two wings of the same bird. Without one, flight is impossible. The collective dimension. Jung's insight was not only personal but collective. He believed that societies, like individuals, can become trapped in one-sided thinking. When civilizations worship only reason, they risk soulless materialism. When they drown in fantasy without grounding, they risk chaos and collapse. The history of humanity can be read as a pendulum swinging between these extremes. Our challenge today is to seek integration, to honor both science and spirit, logic and imagination, the role of the individual. But change begins not with societies but with individuals. Each of us carries both kinds of thought. Each of us must learn when to focus and when to dream, when to analyze and when to create. To repress one is to wound the psyche. To embrace both is to walk the path of individuation, the path toward wholeness. A timeless message. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." To become who we are, we must listen to both voices within us, the voice of reason and the voice of imagination. For reason gives us clarity, but imagination gives us meaning. Closing reflection. As you leave this exploration, ask yourself, which mode of thinking do I rely on most? Do you live mostly in the world of logic, tasks, and analysis? Or do you drift often into dreams, stories, and symbols? And most importantly, how can you bring them together? The journey of integration is lifelong, but every step toward balance brings you closer to truth, to creativity, and to inner peace. Thank you for joining this exploration of Carl Jung's Two Kinds of Thinking. If this journey inspired you, like this video, leave a comment with your reflections, and subscribe to Soulful Energies for more deep dives into psychology and self-discovery. Remember, the mind has two wings, logic and imagination, and when they work together, the soul can truly fly.